Hi everyone! I mentioned in passing recently, kind of jokingly, that I could make an entire video about the topic of what is religion, and somebody in the comments said that they would actually be interested in seeing that video, so here it is. Obviously, this is by no means going to be a definitive answer. I knew before I went into the study of religion academically that this is a very thorny, complicated topic. The question of what the essence of religion or spirituality is, if there's a difference between religion and spirituality, and how we can define these terms. I already knew that this was complicated, and it became even more so the more that I delved into it, especially in my master's year. I spent quite a lot of time focusing on this question. So this is just going to be an overview of my main thoughts that came to mind when I was thinking about this question, in how it relates to my viewers and how I think it might be useful to you, and some of the topics that are most prevalent in my own mind when I'm thinking about my own approach to religion from a personal standpoint. I think a good place to start, and this is actually something I'm going to come back to later in the video, is this question of the relationship between religion and spirituality, or the differentiation between the two. There is quite a lot of divergence of opinion amongst academic scholars of religion on this topic. So on the one side you have people who believe that distinguishing between religion and spirituality is useful, that it is meaningful, and then on the other side you have people who believe that actually the two really need to be considered as one and the same, especially if we are to believe that the term religion can be used meaningfully as a category of human behaviour, of beliefs, of whatever it is, however it is that you want to define that term, but because we are generally lumping in so many different types of beliefs and behaviours under that category of religion, that it therefore is pretty meaningless to differentiate spirituality, because usually when we see people in the community differentiating between spirituality and religion, they're often coming, not always, but often coming from a Christian perspective, where they are seeing religion as denoting traditional, organised religion, often Christianity, and spirituality denoting something that they are doing in their own time personally, or something in which, or a means through which, I suppose, they are pushing back against their traditional religious upbringing. So spirituality is something that is considered to be personal, inherent to the individual, and separated from dogma. And so there definitely are scholars who see that as being an unhelpful distinction, because if they want to understand the term religion as being, like I say, an overarching term that encompasses all of these different ways of engaging with, whatever way it is that they are defining religion, whether it is engaging with supernatural beings or a particular type of communal relationship, a way of answering certain questions or existential crises, etc., etc. I think the tendency to deny this differentiation also largely stems from a very sociological perspective on religion and spirituality, and an insistence on the ever prevalent influence of society, community on the individual, and a desire to deny a lot of the rhetoric that comes along with people who consider themselves spiritual, who talk about spirituality amongst the alternative spiritual community or the New Age community. There tends to be a lot of discussion about the real self, the inherent self, a self which is understood to be unique and that can be accessible separate from how it has been influenced by society. And a lot, I think, of this desire to not seriously take on board the differentiation between spirituality and religion is a desire to not perpetuate this idea, this emic idea. So emic as opposed to etic, emic is the ideas that are coming from the actual practitioners of the religion, and etic or ethic is the perspective that's coming from the scholar. So there is often this desire to not to embrace uncritically the emic perspective of this true inherent self that can be accessed through spirituality, but that is repressed through religion. I can understand that perspective. I think that there are interesting points to be made when you take that perspective on religion or spirituality, and when you make sure to address the inevitable influence of society and culture on an individual and their own sense of self. But I do think that it's very reductive to completely dismiss the taxonomy, the labels used by the practitioners themselves. So personally, I actually do like the differentiation between religion and spirituality. I have used it in my own research, and I have tended to use the word spiritual in its emic sense, so in the way that it is used by practitioners and indeed by myself, because I myself tend to use this differentiation in my own practice. A second thing that is worth mentioning at this point is that the academic study of religion, especially the theory of religion, has been really centered around, for the past 30, maybe even 50 years, it's really been centered around the question and the problem of the world religions paradigm. And this is an idea that was brought forth actually, I think originally in the 70s, and it got expounded upon a lot in the 90s and 2000s. This is an idea that the entire category of religion, the entire way that religion as a concept had been theorized and studied and taught in schools in the West, was based on a very colonial-minded attitude towards other cultures, and that it actually was an exercise in applying an understanding of human experience and human thought that was completely based on the West. It was based on, again, largely Christianity, and that was being applied to other cultures around the world, and that this was the entire way that comparative religion was being undertaken. And so we saw a system in which we had these world religions, and this still largely gets taught in schools. It's getting trickled down very slowly, this pushback against this idea of world religions. You saw a situation in which a certain number of world religions would be classified as real religions or proper religions, because essentially they looked the closest to Christianity. They were the closest thing that could be found in other cultures and other societies that matched what Christianity looked like, or Abrahamic religions. And you end up with a situation where people believed that religion is this inherent transhuman experience, this universal essence of what it is to be human is to be religious. But this conclusion was sort of drawn backwards because, of course, if you take any one experience or institution in a specific culture and then go to other cultures and try to find something similar, you probably are going to find something that is analogous. And then what was happening was people were looking at those other cultures and traditions and saying, well, this thing looks sort of like or enough like Christianity in these ways, therefore it's a religion. And the whole idea, especially within religious studies, but I would say also argue in philosophy as well, the whole philosophy and idea, sociological idea or anthropological idea of what religion was based on this grounding in Christianity is real religion. And of course this arose originally during a period when most of the scholars were actually Christian, and they were actually ready to root themselves in that belief, in this understanding that Christianity really was the true religion. And so from that perspective, it makes sense that you're going to go and look at other cultures and see, well, how close have they gotten to the truth? And what is it that they are doing that is maybe trying to touch on the truth? But you can see how this is hugely problematic, and that ultimately the whole thing starts to break down, and you end up with a situation where some religions are considered lesser religions or not quite really religions because they don't fit enough of the same parameters. And Buddhism is a classic example of this. It's not actually that similar to Christianity, and I think it really has only been adopted under the umbrella of the world religions because it is so prevalent across the world. Otherwise it probably would have been relegated to the not really religious sphere, and sometimes it actually is. So the question then is, where does that leave us? If we realise that a lot of the tradition in the West of studying religions, especially studying them comparatively, if a lot of that has been based on this this foundation of comparing other cultures to Christianity, where does that leave us? How on earth do we start studying religion from another perspective? And that's where it gets complicated, because you have to start coming up with other parameters. And And it really has been a bit of a minefield. So the question then in religious studies, in the theory of religion, has been, where does that leave us? Where do we go from here? How do we start to deconstruct and then reconstruct a concept of religion? Is it meaningful to use the term religion in an academic sense or in a comparative sense at all? I definitely think that there is limited usefulness in applying the term religion comparatively in an academic situation. I think it's useful in normal everyday conversation because we have this general common sense understanding of what religion is through having been educated in this way and through the word having been used in this way. And I think it's not particularly useful to try and throw that out of common everyday language. But I definitely think that in a comparative sense, in the sense of comparative studies of different religions, I think it's of limited usefulness to try to use an universal definition of what religion is in order to set that up. I think a much more useful thing is maybe to, and this is what a lot of scholars have done, is to really broaden the horizons a bit and to start looking at broader human and social situations and cultural contexts, and to widen it out to maybe the concept of culture more generally, and then to decide that you are going to study two different aspects of two different cultures perhaps that seem to reflect or have something that is similar or comparable in some way, that it might be useful to look at those two situations together for whatever reason. There may be some political reason to compare these two ideas, because maybe the two countries have gone through similar political situations. Maybe there is an experiential reason that the people in these two religions are speaking about their experiences in similar ways. There are so many different reasons that you might see a similarity and think that might be an interesting comparative study. But yeah, in terms of theory, in terms of figuring out your parameters of what is and isn't religion, and why you're actually comparing these two things in the first place, are you trying to define what religion is, an essence of religion, by doing this? I don't think personally that that's particularly helpful. I think it is much more helpful if you can look at something broader like the human condition, experience, phenomenology, cultural situations, political situations, and so on. And then we do end up using the word religion because it is just so prevalent. I think it's almost impossible to push a word that is so common out of our vocabulary. But we do just tend to have to be mindful of it now in the academy when we are doing these kinds of studies. We can't use the word religion uncritically and without actually considering what we mean by that word, and the same thing is true of spirituality. So it's definitely not fair to say that every theory of religion that arose before the 1970s is rooted necessarily in this Christocentric perspective. There certainly are some classic theories that came after the 19th century armchair anthropological perspective that was very rooted in a Christocentric. I'd say that shift was happening from the early 20th century onwards. I'm not going to get into too many or any actually of the specific theories. If that's something that you're interested in, it's certainly something you can find easily online. I'm sure that even a Wikipedia article is a good enough place to start seeing the major names that you might want to look up and check out and so on. I will mention though that there have been classically two main ways that people trying to come up with a theory of religion have approached it from a sociological, anthropological, or generally religious studies-esque perspective. And those two types of theories of religion are substantive theories of religion and functional theories of religion. So substantive theories are theories in which there needs to be something, a certain substance in that religion. Now the substance doesn't have to be a material substance, it can be a substance of belief. So theories that involve, that require a religion to have worship of supernatural beings, for example, that's a good example of a substantive theory. They may also require certain material elements or certain, and by material I don't just mean physical objects, but also actions or rituals or things that are being performed materially by the body, and prayers and so on. So in a nutshell, a substantive theory is the idea that where we find X, we find religion. A functional theory of religion, on the other hand, focuses on what people are trying to achieve through whatever set of rituals, of practices, of beliefs. And so this boils down to essentially people who are trying to achieve why are doing religion. So there will be one particular understanding of what is being achieved or what is being aimed for, and that is therefore understood to be religion. Some theories actually combine the two elements. They will have a substantive element and a functional element. I'd say that probably most of the most popular classical theories in the 20th century were probably functional ones, and the earlier 19th century ones were maybe more often substantive. So you have the more phenomenological old school phenomenological theories back in the 19th century, which were much more focused on often a certain type of experience, and this was very much linked into ideas of God and experiencing God and so on. And it often boiled down to essentially, if God is there, then it's religion. And then the more functional ones, like Durkheim is a really classic example. I said I wasn't going to go into any theorists, but many of you will have heard of him. And in these models of religion, you see a lot of discussion of societies needing religion, of religion performing a very specific function for society, often bringing society together, or resolving existential crises and so on, that it provides a very necessary function. You'll often have theorists like this who will demonstrate that, or attempt to demonstrate that, in societies where religion has become less prevalent, where they have become sacralized or have just moved away from their traditional religious background, and that religion really has been shoved off to one side, that you will actually see other types of religion coming in, or the same function coming into play. So where does that leave us in terms of coming up with something that's going to be useful for ourselves, that's going to help us maybe think about religion and spirituality ourselves and get a better grasp of our own understanding of it? It's complicated. I naively thought that I would go into my master's degree and come out of it at the end with a theory of religion, and not only a theory of religion that would be satisfying to me academically, because it's certainly possible maybe in the span of a master's degree to pick one theory, one theorist that resonates with you, and maybe tweak it a little bit and to run with that, to be happy to use that particular understanding of religion or spirituality and to run with that, which to some degree is what I did in my PhD. It was taking particular descriptions and understandings of the term spirituality and running with that, because I didn't in the end want to take up an entire chapter defining it for myself. But I also thought that I might actually come up, that the process of addressing this theory of religion academically, that it might actually help me personally, and that it would actually help me move towards a personal understanding of my theory of religion, of what I think religion is, of what I think especially I was concerned about the philosophy of religion and theology, I suppose, and my own understanding of the combination of mystical and psychological factors that bring about religious experience and the desire to engage with religious and spiritual practice. And unfortunately, I don't really think that any of the modules that I took 2 different modules in the first semester specifically about theory. I don't think either of them really helped me personally at all. If anything, I think that they caused a bit of an existential crisis, a bit of a spiritual crisis in me, because I was so focused on thinking about religion from a very different perspective, from a very sociological perspective, rather than a personal one, and it almost drove out any space at all for thinking about it from a personal experiential level. That being said, I think the more space I get from that time, the more I am actually able to utilize the ideas that I was presented with and the ways of thinking about these questions that I was presented with, in order to think more in a more directed manner about what these words mean and what the experiences mean, and how I can untangle a lot of the different understandings that I do have about spirituality and religion. So first of all, I've already said that I personally believe that it is useful to distinguish between religion and spirituality, and that is very much the case. I'm not going to get into the academic reasons right now that I think that distinction is useful, although that is something that I might come back to, but it's something that more likely you might be able to read about in either when I have my thesis published or when I maybe write something in future. I think it's easier to get into that kind of thing in writing rather than it is in a video necessarily. But from a personal perspective, I would say that Distinguishing between religion and spirituality, first of all, I think it is often personally useful to us, those of us who have actually come out of a traditional religious upbringing of some kind. It is actually useful, emotionally useful to us, and useful in terms of our autobiography, our understanding of our personal narrative. It is actually useful to frame an old experience as religion and a new experience, something new that we're doing, as spirituality, because I think it just reminds us to maybe step away from the tendency to get bogged down in dogma and to get too worried about truth or lack thereof, and whether something that we feel, something that we experience is relevant, is it okay, is it allowed? And focusing on spirituality, our understanding of the word spirituality, because it is so rooted in this idea of autonomy and connecting to your true self, it's even just using that term, even telling ourselves that we now are spiritual and not religious, I think gives us a sense of freedom. It gives us a sense of, it gives us permission, I think, to follow up on the things that we have been repressing during our time of maybe a traditional religious upbringing, and whether those are parts of our own selves. I mean, I have definitely spoken to clients and other friends and people in the past who have been, for example, on the LGBTQIA spectrum, and have had, an enormous part of themselves massively repressed by their religious upbringing. And of course, then when they're moving into their own spirituality, that's an opportunity to start really embracing that part of themselves and celebrating it through their through their spirituality. So that's just one very overt way in which that's important. But I think there are a lot of other deep emotional reasons that it can be very helpful to remind ourselves that we no longer need to look to a traditional religious structure for all of the answers. And I think that often when we start to consider ourselves spiritual but not religious, it means that we have had a break in our lives from believing that that religious tradition actually has all the answers, to realizing that life is a lot more complicated, that the question of divinity and the nature of the universe is something that is unanswerable. It is utterly mysterious, and that any tradition that is telling you that it has all of the answers, definitely pinned down, end of story, is more than likely lying or exaggerating, or at least that those people may be I hesitate to say self-deluded, because I think that's extremely unfair, because I think sometimes it's actually helpful for people to have a particular structure and to choose a particular path, and it can be helpful, it can actually be emotionally validating for some people, as long as it resonates with you and as long as it's not actually repressing something in yourself. But for those people who have felt beaten down by a traditional religion, then it is very, very useful to be able to start letting go of the need to feel beholden to that religious tradition. In a much lighter way, I also actually think it's just useful in my own head to think about religion as something that occurs communally, and spirituality as something that occurs in the privacy of my own home, within my own mind and my own heart. I actually like to think of myself as being part of the broad religion-ish phenomenon of paganism, of pantheism, of witchcraft. That whole sphere, I think of it as religion-ish, religion-esque. It's definitely not a world religion. The world religion's paradigm would never embrace it or adopt it as a religion, because it's not structured enough. It doesn't have strict enough parameters. But I like to think of a community, a spiritual community, actually, in terms of religion, because I think that those communities and the sense of belonging to that community, to that broad community, often we're moving into a functionalist understanding of religion here. I think it does serve a lot of the same functions as being a part of a traditional religious community. We get that sense of holding some of the same values, or often a lot of the same values as the people within that community, and we have a sense of gaining experience and not intuition, inspiration from that community as well. So we might not be beholden to that community. We might not always have to follow everything or believe everything that everyone in that community is saying. We all have very diverging opinions and experiences and beliefs. But it still can be very exciting to be inspired by and to follow along what other people in that community are doing. And I think that's useful. It's useful for me to think about and to make that distinction as well, because it allows me to consider myself a pagan, a witch, all of these different labels that I don't think, they don't feel like they encapsulate what I experience spiritually and what I'm up to in my own personal practice. And I know that my personal practice probably looks a whole lot different to another person who calls themselves a pagan, but it's still useful for me as a label, as a means to insert myself mentally into that community. And then using the term spirituality for my own personal practice, I think it reminds me again to go my own direction and to not feel as though I have to fit in all the time, to not feel like what I'm doing at the altar has to look a certain way in order to consider myself a pagan. And it reminds me, to me it always does, it emboldens me, and it backs up my personal intuition that it is important and vital and valuable to follow up my own instincts and to really express my own personal experiences, my own subjectivity at the altar. I also do actually find the substantive and functional distinction helpful to think about as well when I'm trying to piece together my understanding of my own personal theory of what religion is, what spirituality is, what does it mean, why do we do it. I think that for me, the substantive understanding of spirituality, if I'm going to boil it down to what do I really believe about, let's put religion to one side actually, because like I say, to me religion is very much more a communal, a societal phenomenon. Let's look more towards the spiritual, because the spiritual side to me is the mystical side, and the substantive part of spirituality to me is the mystery. It is the mystical experience. It is sitting at the altar and going through the same motions that I've gone through 10 times before, but feeling something different, moving into a different place, having something alight on me, having my mind open up to something. To me, if I were never in my life to have ever had an experience like that, to have ever had a moment of seeing something differently, of having a shift in perspective, of suddenly feeling myself to be connected to everything outside of myself, of having a shift in consciousness, of suddenly doubting the mundane reality that I normally spend my day-to-day life living within and believing in. If I never had any kind of shift like that in my life, maybe I would not be spiritual. I think for me, my own personal spirituality really hangs on that, and unfortunately it means that it's susceptible to feeling meaningless if I go a long time without a lot of those experiences. Sorry, my seasonal allergies are playing up a bit today, which is why I'm croaking a bit. But yeah, there is this bit of a catch-22 that the more I practice, the more likely I am to have those experiences, but the fewer experiences I have, the less likely I am to practice, and that can become an issue, and it can very easily cause a spiritual slump. But for me personally, I think that is my substantive. I do have a need for a substantive take on spirituality, like that I don't think I would be doing it if I didn't think that there was some essence to spirituality, if I didn't think that there was some divine essence to reality. Now, I don't know whether that means, into my mind, that divinity is something separate to mundane reality. I don't think it's as simple as that. I don't think it's as simple as a binary understanding of physical reality and divine reality and having to tap into that. I think it might be as simple as just that sometimes we tap into the actual mystery that we're living every day and we realise that we don't understand things, and that in and of itself, that is the substance perhaps of spirituality. But yeah, for me that is important. And then it helps me to think about the psychological part of spirituality as being the functional element. So if I'm feeling very skeptical about that substantive part of spirituality, I can remind myself that my tendency to think about spirituality from a functional perspective, so from this perspective of, oh well, it's just a psychological need, it's something that for some reason we've evolved to desire, we've evolved to desire a feeling of connection and a feeling of there being something greater than ourselves because of our need for community. If I find myself falling into that trap, like yes, it can actually be a useful way to look at spirituality, and to explore it and to think about it. It's interesting to me to think about it from a psychological perspective, because sometimes it helps to remind myself that there are psychological reasons as well for practicing or for it to exist. But it is helpful for me ultimately to maintain that distinction and to remember that that's not the only understanding that I have on spirituality. It has been pointed out quite a lot in recent critiques of various theories of religion. It has been pointed out a lot that that purely substantive theories or purely functional theories often don't work, that they often do end up with problems, and that they can get reductive and so on. And it has actually been helpful for me in recent months and years to remind myself of that too, and just to remember not to let myself slip too far into one or the other, because I need to hold both for myself. As always, there is plenty more that I could say on this topic, but I think I've covered the basics, covered as much as I wanted to today, and that might be as much as is actually useful for any of you, because if you're not scholars of religion, then a deep dive into theories of religion and the problems around that might not be at all helpful. But if you do have any specific questions about any of the topics that I raised in this video, do let me know in the comments below. And just in general, I'm always curious to hear your thoughts. Do you have your own worked out theory of religion or spirituality? Do you have an idea of that? But yeah, I'm going to leave it there, especially seeing as I'm just croaking more and more from these stupid allergies. I'm allergic to grass pollen, so it's always a bit of a struggle until a little bit later into August. But thanks so much for watching this video. Don't forget to like the video, because that really helps the algorithm, and it also helps me to know if you found a particular video especially helpful. I actually am more likely, if I see that a video has gotten a higher percentage of likes to views, then I'm actually more likely to make videos like that again in the future. So that's a useful way to let me know that you liked, that you enjoyed the video and you want to see more. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button if you haven't already as well. I'm always very grateful for all of you turning up and watching the video, and especially for those of you who actually comment and let me know your thoughts down below as well. I love engaging with this community that I've built up over the years, and I'm always really curious and really excited to hear your ideas and your thoughts and your feedback. So yeah, do let me know in the comments below, and I'll talk to you again soon.